A group of retired Swiss women, all aged over 64, have won a landmark case at Europe's top human rights court. The judges accepted their argument that older women are particularly vulnerable to global warming, and they ruled that Switzerland's government was not taking sufficient action to protect them. Activists hope the ruling will increase the pressure on governments to curb greenhouse gas emissions.
And joining me now is one of the lawyers who represented the Swiss group in this landmark case. Jessica Simor is joining me now from Zurich, Switzerland. Jessica, it's good to have you with us. When you agreed to take this case, what convinced you that you were on the winning side?
Oh, I wasn't necessarily convinced I was on the winning side before I took the case.
What convinced you?
But it was through working on the case that I became convinced that we could win this case. And one of the key points is, as compared with the younger applicants, these Swiss women had been through all the domestic courts. So the Swiss courts had already looked at the question. And usually the Strasbourg court won't consider a case until the domestic courts have done so.
How did your clients react when they heard about the ruling today?
Oh, they're absolutely delighted. I've just been with them over dinner, and everybody is more than delighted, quite stunned, actually. And I have to say, as the lawyer on the, leading the case, I also was incredibly happy about the result. The court could not have given us any better result. I can't think of any better result that we could have achieved. So we're all absolutely delighted.
You know, we've been reporting all day that this was a group of Swiss senior citizens, pensioners, also all women. Is that by design or was that by chance? And do you think it worked in their favor before this court?
Well, it was by design because in Switzerland, for some reason, you have to be able to establish, to bring a case, that you are particularly affected. So you have to be more affected than somebody else. And it's not good enough to just show that you're affected. And elderly women are particularly badly affected by heat because the ability of an older woman's body to regulate temperature is less effective than the equivalent aged man. So older women and very young babies are particularly affected by heat waves, as we see by the vast numbers of people who have died in the last few heat waves that we've had over the last decade in Europe.
Fascinating. How important is this ruling, in your opinion, in the global fight against climate change? Because I'm sure you agree with me, this is not a Swiss issue. This is an issue for all of us on the planet.
It is incredibly important globally. First of all, it's binding on all the member states of the Council of Europe. So all the member states need to look at this ruling and ensure that their legislation provides carbon budgets which take you down the path to meet the temperature threshold of 1.5 degrees provided in the Paris Agreement. And secondly, it's important globally because effectively what it says is that states who signed up to the Paris Agreement, knowing what it meant, must meet those obligations. And a failure to meet those obligations is a breach of their citizens' human rights.
That all sounds good, Jessica. Is it going to make a difference on the ground?
It will make a difference in many countries. It will affect judgments across the world. Possibly it will also influence the International Court of Justice because they're giving an advisory opinion on the meaning of the Paris Agreement. There are some countries that will never comply properly. There are countries that are repeated offenders in failing to comply with the convention. But I have no doubt that a country such as Switzerland will want to meet its binding obligations. I think you said that it was morally binding, but it is actually binding as a matter of international law. And in many countries, that is also binding as a matter of domestic law.
And sticking with Switzerland for just a moment before we run out of time, Switzerland is known for its direct democracy. These women chose to take this case to court, though, obviously, because things had not worked on their home turf. So if elections don't lead to change, if political leaders don't forge change, can one litigate the change that is needed, particularly when we're talking about mitigating against climate change?
Well, in Switzerland, it's particularly problematic because they have referendums. And one of the defenses run by the government was, we had a referendum on this, and the people decided they didn't want it. And therefore, we've done our best, effectively. But this is something that comes up all the time in relation to human rights. It's the conflict between this idea of democracy as just what the people choose and democracy as entailing some fundamental and universal rights, which matter irrespective of what the majority decides. So democracy is not merely rule of the majority. It is also rule of the majority subject to some fundamental norms.
Attorney Jessica Simor, congratulations are in order to you and your clients. We appreciate you taking the time. I know it's been a very busy day for you. We appreciate you talking with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Joining me here in the studio now is our senior climate reporter, Louise Osborne. Louise, these Swiss women say that this is a historic ruling. Is it?
I mean, it's a really important ruling, a landmark case, as we've heard many times now. It's the first time an international court has ruled that weak climate policies can violate human rights, and that is a huge thing. The court even went as far to say that the European Convention of Human Rights encompasses protection by the state for serious adverse effects of climate change on lives, health, well-being and quality of life. So it's really holding governments responsible for the quality of life of their citizens when it comes to climate change.
This ruling, it's the voice, the authority here is more of a moral one, isn't it? I mean, we're not talking about the court being able to force the Swiss government to do anything, but what exactly will happen now that this ruling has been handed down?
So there is the expectation that the Swiss government will re-examine its climate goals, and it said that it would do that. The court said that they were woefully inadequate as they are. There are no limits that have been set by the Swiss government, for example, in terms of the amount of emissions that it wants to reduce. And it has failed to meet some targets in the past as well. So the European Court of Human Rights is really saying that the Swiss government needs to do something about that. But more importantly, this case also opens doors to other cases and makes other countries vulnerable to the kind of cases that we've just seen.
And why Switzerland? And there were other cases that were thrown out, right? Portugal, France, and most people don't think of Switzerland as being the place where you have, I guess, the least being done to save the environment.
I mean, it's hard to know why Switzerland got through as a case. I mean, there were two other cases at the court as well, one against Portugal and 32 other European nations. The other one against France. Those two were both thrown out, perhaps because Switzerland is so small and this was such a detailed look at what they have been doing, and perhaps because these women could also prove that there was, an impact on their life as a result of the climate change and the adverse effects that we're seeing through that, the extreme weather that we are seeing, heat waves, flooding, all of these kinds of things. I mean, we saw today, for example, that this is the 10th month in a row that there has been a record set for heat. So perhaps all that aided the judges to make these decisions.
And senior citizens are particularly vulnerable to these heat waves, and we expect more and more heat waves to take place as we get closer to summer. This ruling is, of course, for Switzerland and also for the entire world, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Switzerland has said it will re-examine its own goals, but actually this does have much wider ramifications, not only for the 46 countries that are part of the Council of Europe and so under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, but also for countries all over the world that are still not doing enough to tackle climate change. And there are cases that we are seeing happening already in Australia, Brazil, Peru, beyond, that will be coming up and have been watching to see what this result would be so that they can take those cases further.
Louise, before we run out of time, is it ironic that a group of Swiss senior citizens, women, were able to get a court ruling that Greta Thunberg and a young generation of climate activists have not been able to do. Did that strike you?
I mean, I think that these youth activists have driven a lot of the action that we've seen. You know, before Greta Thunberg took to the steps of the Swedish Parliament, we saw very little about climate change and not a lot of action taken against that. So, you know, maybe these court cases wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for those activists speaking up to begin with.
Louise Osborne, good to have you here in the studio. Excellent analysis. Thank you.